Hi, I'm Joe Bernard, TheTrueRevelation.com. 75 to 80% of all that is written about the return of the Lord is written in the major and minor prophets and various other scriptures throughout the Old Testament, in which it is written of the gathering of God's people throughout all nations and the sudden destruction of God's enemies, the kingdoms of this world, occurring at the same time. It speaks of the clouds, the trumpets, the opening of the graves, the resurrection. It speaks of the wrath of the Lord. All of these are a constant theme throughout the major and minor prophets and even various other scriptures throughout the Old Testament. In most teachings of the return of the Lord, New Testament scriptures are the only ones that are referenced, which means that we are only referencing about 20 to 25% of the scripture that is available to us. However, the New Testament scripture does stand alone and makes a very clear point that the meeting in the air occurs at the same time the sudden destruction falls upon those that are appointed to God's wrath, to the wrath of the Lord upon the day of the Lord, which happens to occur at such a time that the entire world declares peace and safety, as in after a tribulation. Those that teach a pre-tribulation or mid-tribulation rapture lift 1 Thessalonians 4 and 16 and 17 out of its context to separate it from the sudden destruction. They don't want you to know that the sudden destruction occurs with the meeting in the air. However, in the 75 to 80% of what is said in the major prophets, major and minor prophets, illustrates that the gathering of God's people occurs at the same time the sudden destruction comes upon the kingdoms of this world. Well, for most of those that believe in a rapture before the day of the Lord, this does not matter. Even though the scripture makes it overwhelmingly clear that the gathering occurs at the same time of the sudden destruction upon the kingdoms of this world, they refuse to believe it. Why? Because in the mind of the rapturists, those that believe in a rapture before the Lord's day coming, they believe that their belief is just as good as Scripture. They believe that this is not a salvation issue. Therefore, they can take a Scripture and use it any way that they want, and they are not convinced that this is a salvation issue. Therefore, they feel that there is no consequences, and they feel that there is nothing wrong with a belief like this, and that it encourages Christians to live right, and that there is some good that will come out of it. However, it is teaching Christians that God is going to deliver them from a tribulation which God will not deliver them from, and God will allow His sheep, His little ones, as it is said, the shepherd's little ones, which are Christians of the shepherd, two-thirds of them will die during the tribulation. So if many of the Christians believe that they won't even go through the tribulation, when this time occurs, many of them will forsake Christ, many of them will forsake the Word, many of them will forsake Christianity altogether. The rapturists go so far in what they believe as to deny the very Christ that brought them. What am I saying? They deny that Christ's finished work on the cross brought everlasting reconciliation and made a complete and total end of sin for our sakes, for those that live in righteous obedience unto Christ. Their belief in a rapture is so much more superior and so much more important than the very Christ that came to save them. It is more important than their belief in God. The rapture is more important than their belief in all of Scripture. The rapturists are in a trance, under a strong delusion, that regardless of all of Scripture, all truth, everything that is overwhelming to the point that they hold a false position does not matter, because what they believe is more important than all of those things. Therefore, this presentation is not for the rapturist. It is for those that respect and honor Scripture for what it says. And the Scripture says that the meeting in the air occurs at the same time of the sudden destruction. And in Old Testament prophecy, major and minor prophecy, the gathering of God's people from every country occurs on the Lord's day when He destroys His enemies. For those that are sincere, that means a lot. It means that Christ will have the ultimate victory, and that the church will have the ultimate victory, and that the church will be here as promised, everlasting unto the end. So that should mean a lot to us. And it should mean a lot to those that love the Lord, that God has promised to protect those that do not teach a false rapture during a time of tribulation. And I would note this as well. Those that teach false doctrines concerning the prophecies of God are promised to be punished and rejected of God. That is the promise of the Scripture. Therefore, this is a salvation issue, and one that we should all take heed of. This presentation is as a result of another presentation that I did, 101 Lies of the False Rapture. And you will find out from this presentation how that the vast majority of what is written about the Lord's Day coming is substantiated from the major and minor prophets. Thank you for joining me.